Good evening. My name is Peter Bowman, and I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to both our in-person audience and our online audience for this inaugural William and Patricia Ayers Global Tipping Point Series event. Bill and Pat are longtime supporters of the important work of the Council, and Pat served on our board of directors in the early 2000s. She was critical in helping us to navigate through a very difficult period for the organization. We're deeply grateful to the entire Ayers family for their generous support in helping to create a sustainable future for our organization. Our other sponsors are the New Hampshire chapter of the Fulbright Association and our what I call existentially important mission sponsor, Southern New Hampshire University. For those unfamiliar with the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire, I'd like to fill you in on a little bit of that. We are a non-for-profit organization supported financially by memberships, program fees, grants, donations, and sponsorships, both from individuals and from businesses. If you're not already a member, we'd love to have you join our organization. Talk with any of our staff or board members, or go to our website, wacnh.org, to find out how to be a part of our journey forward. We're a platform for discussion and take no positions on policy, politics, parties, candidates, and the views expressed by our speaker this evening are his and not ours. We have fostered learning and discussion and involvement in world affairs in the state of New Hampshire since 1954. If you do the math, that's about 70 years. Almost as old as I am, but not quite. We help create and sustain international connections that enhance our state's cultural, economic, and civic life. We build global knowledge and understanding through educational programs for communities and schools on the subject of foreign policy. We help develop international leaders in partnership with the U.S. Department of State. And finally, we believe that an informed public is one of the bedrock principles of a working democracy. I will now introduce this evening's speaker. Darren Kew is an associate professor and executive director of the Center for Peace, Democracy, and Development at UMass Boston. He principally studies the connection between democratic institution building in Africa and the development of political cultures that support democracy, particularly in terms of the role of civil society groups in that effort. Kew has worked with the Council on Foreign Relations for preventive action to provide analysis and blueprints for preventing conflicts in several areas around the globe, including Nigeria, Central Africa, and Kosovo. He's been a consultant to the UN, USAID, the State Department, and a number of NGOs, including the Carter Center. His work on how conflict resolution methods promote democratization of national political cultures is one of the first of its kind, linking these important fields. The title of his presentation is The Future of Democracy in Africa. Professor Kew.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you to the Council for inviting me to speak tonight. I've been asked to speak for about 20 minutes or so, but being an academic, I may go over that. We're paid by the word, as you know, so I may get a little long-winded on a couple of these subjects, and it's certainly something that that is close to my heart. Much of my work over the years has been in Nigeria, so even though I'm starting very broad, I do want to circle in on Nigeria, which is the country on the continent that I certainly know best. But I think that there are a number of trends that are present there that you will find in other parts of the continent. But I think I need to start with first acknowledging we're talking about, nearly 50 different countries. So there's tremendous variation across the continent. So I don't mean to suggest that you're going to find this in every country. But I think there, at least for conversation purposes and perhaps for spurring some of your questions on the subject, I wanted to start broad first, and then I'll sort of move in to focus on Nigeria. Let me start with some thoughts about democracy overall, because I think there are global patterns here that are really important to think about in terms of understanding what's happening on the continent. And I guess the first thing to know about democracy in general is I think I want to say that global trends matter very much in terms of influencing the direction of democratic development worldwide. But for some of the other trends we'll talk about, make Africa in particular especially susceptible to what's happening elsewhere. In particular, the direction that the world is going in terms of opening up towards more democratic freedoms, as we saw in the 1990s, or in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, an increasing closing down of democratic freedoms worldwide, tends to create a trend in terms of legitimacy and acceptance of undemocratic or non-democratic solutions to problems. But also shifts in terms of support from more powerful countries around the world. So we are now in a period that some folks call the global democratic recession. Some people are starting to say it's spiraled into a depression in some parts of the world. But clearly in countries like the United States, where we saw backsliding under the Trump administration, in terms of actively discrediting elections and that sort of thing, the situation in Russia and Russia's increasing active support of anti-democratic or non-democratic movements around Western Europe and elsewhere in the West, and China's growing strength worldwide and its ambivalence towards democratic support, if not hostility in some circumstances, has really changed the global picture for democracy worldwide. And Africa, not having sort of a global superpower present on the continent to insulate somewhat from those trends, is particularly susceptible to whichever way sort of the global political winds are blowing. So we're a far cry from 1992, where the United States could, through threats of withholding aid, could push Kenya and Tanzania and other countries in parts of Africa down a democratic path. Now, all of these countries have different places they can turn, and we have seen a lot of African countries and a lot of African foreign policy experts are talking about the benefits and costs of playing off the Chinese and the Western powers and the Russians and others off against each other. So African foreign policy has a lot more places to turn. So that means in terms of global trends to bring pressure for democracy, it's a very different climate than we were in 30 years ago. So that global trend matters importantly. And so not surprisingly, you can see that over the last 10 years or so, we've certainly seen some governance backsliding across the continent. These numbers here come from the Mo Ibrahim Index, which is from the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which is a Africa-based foundation that is keeping track of a lot of governance trends. And this is sort of a composite index. And the numbers themselves are perhaps less important for our conversation, just to show that you can see sort of a flat line in terms of democratic outcomes. And since 2018, that number going down, I would argue that probably in the last couple of years, those numbers have continued to go down. And the Ibrahim Index breaks it down even further in terms of several indicators. On the far left, and the two leftmost ones are particularly the most important indicators for democracy building. Participation, rights, and inclusion on the far left. Then comes security and the rule of law. And then human development and economic opportunity on the right. You see that on the bottom right, you can see red being worse and green being better. In terms of sort of democratic freedoms, the last 10 years, particularly up until 2020, you see an increasing number of countries, and on the far left, 29 countries in particular got far worse over that decade in terms of participation, rights, and inclusion. The sort of the fundamental drivers of democracy that we'd be concerned about. Where interestingly, at the bottom right, you see 22 countries on the continent saw at least economic opportunity increase or improve fairly well during that period. So we see a decade of the last decade of economic possibilities opening, but political and particularly sort of democracy building opportunities closing over that decade. And I'm going to argue in a minute that you'll certainly be able to say that over the last couple of years, those concerns or those trends on the Democratic side have gotten even worse. Let me just add to the mix, back to my first chart here. Is this just shows sort of the global? This is the Freedom House numbers here, which has a three stage metric for measuring freedom: free, partly free, and not free. And you see much of Africa is in the not free category here. You see right down here at the bottom, you have sort of a cone around South Africa, and then little Ghana there in the free category, and then a number of countries, and Nigeria right here in the middle there, and some of East Africa sort of in the partly free zone, and then of course much of the rest of the continent very much in terms of the not free column here. So trends going in sort of the not free direction over the last 10 years. And so this environment that is growing increasingly difficult democracy is an important piece of sort of thinking about democracy on the continent. Second, I would say that, and this is going to be no surprise as well, is that poverty and demographics also matter very much in terms of democratic success and democratic development. These are some points in terms of just Nigeria specifically. Just to say that Nigeria, like much of the rest of the continent, it has an extremely unequal society. In Nigeria's case, roughly 80% of Nigerians live on less than $2 a day. And with the top 5% roughly of Nigerians having or owning at least 50% of the wealth in that country. So extreme differences between those who have and those who have not. Resulting in some of the worst social indicators in the world in Nigeria about 15, 20 years ago. Over the last decade, we've seen those numbers improve slightly. So there are some at least improvement over there. However, it's still a dark picture in terms of human indicators for much of Nigeria. And this is sort of a picture you would find across much of the continent. Where you see highly concentrated sources of wealth, and particularly in the hands of those who are closer to government and sources of power. So consequently, you see really high corruption statistics all across the continent. Nigeria is typically in one of the top 5 or top 10 most corrupt countries on the Transparency International global corruption indexes, and many of the other African countries also fall into that bottom 20% of corruption across the continent. Africa is also perhaps the youngest continent in the world at this point. You see, these are the Nigerian population overall. Population growth in Nigeria has jumped somewhere between 2.5 and 3% per year over the last several decades, and that is only increasing, such that Nigeria, which has an area of roughly northeastern United States in terms of land area, will surpass the United States in terms of population by roughly the middle of this century. It's somewhere around 210 million people at this point. So it will probably pass us in the next sort of 30 years if conditions stay roughly the same. So this means that because of this massive demographic increase, the population profile in Nigeria looks very much like developing countries. Those of you interested or follow those sort of demographic charts that show that break down at one level after another, at which age group where most of the population is, you'll see a pyramid fashion where most Nigerians, at least 50%, perhaps as many as 60% of Nigerians are somewhere under the age of 25. So an extremely young population, an extremely large population, growing up in countries with weak institutions, with massive corruption, with increasing security problems, is the sort of environment that we're talking about democracy building across the continent. So one thing, though, I think for a starting place in thinking about this conversation is that democracy, one way to think about democracy is it the roots from which it developed. And democracy particularly, and again, I'm generalizing broadly, but has sort of roots in oligarchy. It comes out of power centers where you have large, sort of powerful networks, typically centered around an individual or a family that has strong connections or networks of supporters and has some sort of resource base that it is able to continue its influence. And it's these sorts of oligarchs that usually are the determining factor in terms of the laying the basis for democracy over time, or on the other end, when democracies unravel, they tend to unravel into some sort of oligarchic forms. And a lot of the authoritarian models that we see around the world are often signified by the rise of one particular network with an individual or sort of a group at the center of that model. And so much of African politics can be thought of in terms of the competition among these various oligarchies for control. And Nigeria is sort of best described as a competitive oligarchy. It was for a long time a military dictatorship throughout much of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 1990s. And then in 1999, like much of the rest of the continent in the 1990s, you see the handing over from military rule to civilian rule, which was a step in the direction of democratization. And we have formal institutional, democratic institutions on paper, particularly in terms of legislatures and courts and so on. But the way politics tends to develop is the politics of these oligarchic networks, these powerful individuals and their networks who have sort of a stranglehold on many of these institutions, and it's the battle among these oligarchs that determines the outcomes of politics. And this is, in a nutshell, the story of politics in Nigeria in many ways, but it's also across much of the continent. And so what we're thinking about in terms of democratization is how do you democratize many of these oligarchic networks? How do you get these oligarchic groups to increasingly play by the rules and increasingly respect institutions? Which, at the moment, many of them have the perspective of seeing institutions as vehicles for their personal enrichment and personal power development. So getting those institutions in place and the shift from oligarchy to a more sort of competitive oligarchy to eventually something of a democratic system is a story of trying to get these oligarchs to first and foremost to set aside violence as a tool in politics. And the degree to which these sort of oligarchic networks will turn to violence in solving their problems is often a very important barometer of which direction political governance is going in many of these countries, and in essence, which direction democracy may be going in the continent. Second is a question of to what extent will these oligarchic networks grow increasingly transparent and play by a rule of law system. To what extent will they begin to see rule of law as in their own interest in terms of taking care of the interests that their networks support? And the outcome of that, in the end, is to what extent can we turn oligarchic networks into functioning institutions? And oftentimes, the first step in that is turning oligarchic networks into political parties. And so the political parties' circumstances across the continent is an important harbinger of democratic development in most of these countries. And I'll argue in particular in a moment that the key turning point in sort of democratic development across the continent is when we move to a circumstance of having one dominant political party dominated by one or a coalition of these oligarchic networks to at least two political parties where we have a respectful political opposition. And that is sort of a viable political opposition, one that is willing to try to play by the rules, and in order for it to take power, wants to push for elections, and particularly clean elections. And then once we get towards closer clean elections, because of the push of political opposition for those, we get to a picture of strengthened institutions and ultimately begin to bring the public back into the picture. Because in essence, the move from oligarchy to democracy is a step from moving from a politics dominated by these political networks to a politics where these political networks are engaging the broader public, reaching down into the public, and in essence see an interest personally in trying to serve the public interest. And when do they serve the public interest? It is because they need the public interest in order to win power. And when do they do that? It's when elections mean something. And when do elections mean something? It's when you have a circumstance where you have these countervailing forces of a political opposition able to sort of push for increasingly clean elections. So there's a domino effect there that is started off by the rise of viable political opposition on the continent. And that is signified by the politics of these oligarchic networks. So when I talk about Nigeria in a second, I'm going to argue that democracy in essence sort of balances upon the rise of this kind of balance of power among oligarchic networks. And if you think about our own experience in terms of American democracy and the whole notion of checks and balances, checks and balances is in one way nothing more than an institutional balance of power. And so democratization in essence can be seen through the lens of the rise of balance of powers among the various power factions that exist in the country as they're constituted. So this is just sort of one schematic of the balance of power equation in Nigeria. So you look at the various institutional actors that have a centrality of resources to them, and the biggest ones in Nigeria, and you find this across much of the continent, is the presidency or the executive branch. Tends to have the strongest monopoly over resources. And then in Nigeria being a federation, the subnational units, the executives at the subnational units also tend to have a predominance of those resources. So the overwhelming power is in the actors that control those and the oligarchic networks that are controlling those two institutions there. But if there are other institutions and other actors that are also not part of the formal institutional base, and in particular you look at civil society and business there, which is where I'm going to go in terms of thinking about where the future is, it's a balance among these actors so that as we strengthen these different actors against each other so that they can check and balance and they can police each other, such that the oligarchs themselves cannot simply do everything that they want, but in order to get things done, they have to work with each other over time. It's these institutions and it's this balance of power among actors in office and in opposition parties in particular that provide that initial balance that can then lead to the balance among these institutions. Part of the key equation is also going to be civil society and business. Actors that are outside of the government who can also have this power balancing role. The strengthening of these actors can at least provide some of this balance, but you'll see I don't weigh them really highly here, is that civil society and business cannot do it alone. They are extremely dependent upon working with these other actors in government and with the public itself. So the more that we can see a distribution through these different actors, the better we can think in terms of strengthening democracy across the continent. So legislatures, civil society and the media, business, strengthening these actors. And lastly, I want to point out an important piece of this in the Nigerian context, which is an issue in some other countries across the continent, is federalism or decentralization. Is that the less that you have power simply in the center and at the federal executive level, the more it creates more opportunities for other oligarchs to gain power and to check and balance each other over time. So in Nigeria's case, because the governors have a certain access to the central coffers of the state, they are important, powerful actors in sort of balancing the presidency and what the presidency wants to do. The more that legislatures, the National Assembly and the state assemblies and local governments can also begin to get access to federal funds and can provide more vehicles for political forces to each pursue their own differing interests, the more it's going to strengthen institutions over time. And then the courts play an important role in this. Of all all these different concerns that I put out there, I would argue that security is perhaps the first and foremost concern across the African continent. And it's very difficult, and if not impossible, to have democracy in a war zone. And so the countries that are most insecure, the ones that are facing the most in terms of insurgencies and warfare across the continent, not surprisingly, have some of the lowest scores in terms of democratic development. And if we went back to that map of Africa, a lot of those purple countries, you won't be surprised, are also synonymous with important sort of war zones. And across the continent, in West Africa, we're seeing across the Sahel a growing zone of Islamist activity that stretches from Mali all the way to Nigeria. You might have heard of movements like Boko Haram in Nigeria, which became famous 10 years ago for kidnapping groups of schoolgirls and selling them for ransom to the state, which led in Nigeria to the rise of an entire ransom economy. So many kidnapping groups have subsequently ballooned across Nigeria. So we have Boko Haram in the northeast having an Islamist insurgency. In northwestern Nigeria, we have these banditry groups or these kidnapping gangs, which are increasingly making circumstances insecure in business very difficult to conduct, and consequently politics very difficult to conduct. In southeastern Nigeria, an insurgency movement has also risen there that has a separatist dimension to it, connected to, some of you may remember the Biafran independence movement in the 1960s. There's a new Biafran movement happening in that same part of the country, as well as a oil-based insurgency in Nigeria's oil-producing region in the south-south. So you have multiple security problems in one country alone that makes it extremely difficult for these sorts of institutions to flourish. East Africa is facing its own insurgency. Somalia obviously has been at civil war now for on and off since the early 1990s. Ethiopia facing its own insurgency now that is undermining fragile democratic institutions there, plus having an ongoing conflict with Eritrea, although there's now an understanding at the moment between those two powers. Tanzania facing an insurgency along its borders, and then the ongoing insurgencies within the Democratic Republic of Congo, right in the middle of the continent. So the continent is awash in security concerns that make it extremely difficult for democratic institutions to flourish, simply because the basics of democratic politics are extremely difficult during the wartime period. A second concern across the continent, and which plays a role in Nigerian democracy, is that these countries are themselves extremely ethnically diverse. Colonialism across the continent lumped together many nations under one roof, such that Nigeria itself has over 200 different ethnicities living under one political roof, divided by Islam in the north, roughly 50%, and Christianity in the south, roughly 50%. So the identity differences all across the continent make things particularly concerning. And so consequently, all across the continent, you see the rise of ethnic bargaining principles. And I would argue that this is an important part of sort of democratic development on the continent as well, is that the countries that have been able to work out some sort of an ethnic bargaining principle have been able to move beyond simply ethnic politics to begin to get down to greater policy outcomes. And Nigeria in 1999, when it returned to civilian rule, began with a basic ethnic compromise that said that power would rotate between the north and the south in Nigeria, and would also rotate across 6 different ethnic zones. This understanding, which is not codified in the Constitution anywhere, but has been something of an agreement among the politicians, has held up more or less until recent elections, and has come under increasing concern. And in the election forthcoming in 2023 in Nigeria, we see a possible outcome where this ethnic bargain may break down, and this could cause important problems in terms of this ethnic security that I'm talking about. So in order to get to this bargaining structure, it again brings us back to this question of the balance of power, is when you have a circumstance where you have different political parties that are able to balance each other out, it creates a circumstance where the elites are able to work out a bargaining culture over time. So over the last 20 years in Nigeria of civilian rule, we've seen the rise of this bargaining culture, which has been an important part of democratic development in Nigeria overall. And the maintenance of this bargaining culture is an essential first step in terms of building a greater coalition among these various oligarch groups that I was talking about. And from that, they can build more stable political coalitions, which is the formation of more stable political parties. And in Nigeria and a lot of the places across Africa that we can talk about, you've seen growing political strength and growing political party strength based on these sort of ethnic political compromises. And so in Kenya, for instance, the ruling coalition that just won this election is based upon an ethnic coalition that has been built up over these years. And these ethnic coalitions are beginning to grow into more stable political party arrangements upon which can come better political policy over time. So how do we get democracy? Through the development of these sort of balance of power that creates this sort of ethnic bargaining culture, and also through this balance of power creates an interest in the elites themselves as they are competing with each other to begin to reach downward to the public itself and to civil society. And so it's in that competition with each other that the public and civil society becomes more important. And this, in essence, begins to broaden the coalition that is engaged in politics across the continent. And it's the broadening of these coalitions and the increasing importance of the public and civil society over time that I think increases the strength of democracy, and is, I think, what we're looking for. And when I talk about Nigeria in a minute, I want to sort of go through how that exactly has happened over in recent years. Lastly, also, I want to mention again what I said about the importance of federalism, is I think that federal structures are really important as well in terms of decentralizing the centralization of power in the presidency and in these sort of powerful individuals that creates more opportunities for oligarchic competition to take place, and it's in that competition that the power balance that I'm talking about can be built. So in Nigeria's case, there's a few trends here that I want to end on and sort of open in terms of our conversation and to get your questions on where you'd like this conversation to go. Nigeria has had this sort of oligarchic competition for over 20 years across the continent. And it's been fairly well unchecked, leading to the continuation of these sort of corruption patterns. It's happened at the same time as the sort of security deterioration that I was talking about has increased. Nigeria has seen the rise of Boko Haram in the northeast, these banditry gangs in the northwest that have undermined the powers of the center and have increasingly made the country ungovernable in the last several years. And in particular since COVID, and Nigeria, like the rest of the world, instituted a number of lockdowns that seem to have provided an opportunity for many of these banditry movements to take advantage of the situation. And we've seen an increase in these sort of criminal activity all across Nigeria that has made security worsen countrywide. As I mentioned as well, Nigeria depended very much on this elite compact between oligarchs across the different ethnic groups across Nigeria, north, south, east, and west. And this compromise, under the pressures of the deteriorating security picture, has come under increasing pressure. And we've also seen over the years a number of political elites willing to refuse to hand over power from one direction to the other. And we have an important presidential election coming up in 2023, at which point we're looking at a northerner and a southerner vying for the presidency, and an additional southerner has also is in the mix if the current president is from the north and from a Muslim Hausa background, if the power does not rotate toward these southern groups, particularly in terms of the southwest or the southeast, then I think this pact is going to be seen as broken, and this is going to continue to create a dwindling of this elite pact, and going to undermine in the interest of these elites in playing by the rules. Let me just show a couple of basic economic indicators about Nigeria, just to give some of that picture as well. Nigeria is the largest economy on the continent, though at times South Africa has surpassed it at different moments. South Africa's GDP per capita is much, much higher than Nigeria's, however, given Nigeria's much, much larger population. But you see, at least, Nigeria's GDP increasing, but then over the last 5-10 years, those numbers have stagnated, and even in the last couple of years have gotten worse. Inflation is also very high, and unemployment is probably much, much higher than 10%. And going back to that demographic boom that I was talking about, you overlay that with some of these numbers, and you see here in particular, Nigeria's had recessions, several recessions in the last 5 years alone. In part through economic mismanagement by the current president, but with this increasingly poor economic picture, you see a growing dissatisfaction with the center that is undermining a lot of these concerns I have for building a greater elite, this balance of power between the elites, and growing, strengthening of political parties in Nigeria, leading to better policy outcomes. So, where to look for in terms of hope in regard to this picture? Much of the work that I focus on is on civil society and trying to help re-engage the public and civil society actors into this sort of oligarchic-dominated picture, and to try to sort of bring oligarchic politics back down to individuals. And much of civil society's efforts over the years has been focused on trying to engage political parties and the presidency to move towards greater democratic reforms. But over the last 10 years in particular, civil society has found some important allies in the legislatures, and the National Assembly and the state assemblies, who are far outgunned in terms of political powers against the executives at those two levels. So much of what I think needs to happen is an involvement and an expansion of civil society engagement of actors in the legislatures at the federal and the state level. And so strengthening civil society is a many-faceted issue, and it's one that I'd like to talk more about maybe when we get to question and answers in a minute. But civil society itself is oftentimes a host of very small organizations, NGOs with maybe 10, 15 employees that are working on issues of human rights, refugees, peacemaking, and so on. But there are also much larger civil society groups like the trade unions, which could have up to 1 million members in some of those organizations. All of civil society is just as influenced by this sort of oligarchic politics as other institutions are. But many of them are able to provide these sort of safe havens where at least some sort of democratic activity can continue. And I think many of these safe havens are located in several of Nigeria's cities, and I think you'll find this across the continent. Is civil society development is often talking about trying to salvage or to extend civil society strength particularly in metropolitan areas, and to move those from there into the rural areas. And there are a number of really interesting initiatives in Nigeria and Lagos. For instance, an initiative called JEI that works particularly in slums and provides legal assistance to slum dwellers and teaches them how to become paralegals, so that they themselves can actually take their cases to local courts and can try to improve their own rights. And then those people that get trained by JEI join the organization as active members and have real roles in deciding the direction of the group. So there are a lot of initiatives like that you find in various parts of the country. Engagement of those and support of those are particularly important, I think, in terms of civil society development and sort of building this bottom-up link. Business development is also very important as well. Nigeria has seen, and particularly in Lagos, has seen a real tech boom over the last 20 years. I can show you a slide here later that shows from 2000 to roughly 2010, a meteoric rise in the number of cell phones and smartphones that Nigerians have. So all across the country, more and more people are connected to global networks, much like the rest of the world. And this has provided a really important, first of all, sort of small business opportunity for small and medium-sized businesses, businesses, particularly in Lagos, to try to build a host of sort of technology-related businesses in Lagos and its environs. But it has also provided important tools for civil society actors for organization. So in the last 5 years, we've seen an increasing number of particularly professionals in Lagos and other sort of urban hubs across the country have seen protesters filling the streets protesting corruption, protesting police brutality. This offers one very important vision of what the future could look like in Nigeria in terms of the empowerment of these groups, trying to work with other civil society actors in order to engage the public to try to push the oligarchs in the directions of cleaner elections and better policy outcomes. And in many ways, I think this is sort of what the future is a struggle between, on the one hand, these sorts of progressive entrepreneurs who are interested in greater small business development and who are interested in and are willing to sort of protest on the streets for pushing for greater political reforms on the one hand, and on the other hand, the growth of these sort of militant groups who are providing important economic opportunities, particularly for young men across Nigeria and other African countries. So it's really sort of the entrepreneur versus the militant in the future, and a question of which of these are going to win out in terms of the trends that we were talking about. And I think the election is going to, in Nigeria and elections all across the continent this year, are going to be important bellwethers. If we see greater civil society involvement in these elections, if we see civil society development from the bottom up, then we'll see more engagement of these oligarchic networks that can try to produce the sort of balance of power that I'm talking about. In particular, the rise of these of political opposition parties that are able to check and balance the government and to sort of bring back more of the sort of power in the center among the executives, greater down to the peoples, leading to greater policy outcomes. So that's sort of a general overview of democracy on the continent as best I could. I've gone over, I think, a lot of very broad trends very quickly, so I thank you for your indulgence on that. And I tried to go a little bit into some of the trends in Nigeria, but I'd be very happy to go into some more of the specifics, particularly in Nigeria, though I can talk about a couple of other countries possibly, depending on the question that you ask. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions and our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a fascinating and pretty rich presentation. You touched on a number of things, and I'm curious about one in particular, and that is effectively communication. How does a burgeoning democratic society and democratic institutions communicate in Africa? Perhaps just address Nigeria, but is a free press important? How many people speak the same language? How many people communicate, with one another effectively?
Thank you for that. And I would throw that bargaining culture among the elites, into that communication, category as well, in terms of important to think about. I mean, I think all across the continent, just like the rest of the world, the social media revolution and the sort of the cell phone revolution has been fundamental in changing, I think, the basic way that people interact with one another. So, I remember as late as the 1990s, just trying to do research, just trying to set up an appointment. I would have to show up myself, I'd have to drive there, and invariably the person wasn't there. I'd have to set up an appointment, and then I'd have to come back, and the person wasn't there, and I'd have to come back 2 or 3 times. Now I can just send a text message, and everyone across Nigeria can do the same thing. And the internet pervasiveness is fairly well complete across much of the country. There are some dead zones, but more or less it's fairly well pretty much 90-something% of the country. And so this opens up so many different opportunities in terms of people being able to communicate with each other, and it's led to a lot of the sort of the revolutionary trends you're seeing on the streets in terms of activists now have a variety of ways that you saw for instance, in the Arab Spring, in terms of using Facebook, using social media outlets, TikTok now in ways, and WhatsApp groups, to get information around about about what's happening, about where protests are going to take place, and then of course the video connected to it, keeping track of the abuses of the regime, which then tends to spark more protests as regime brutality is actually brought in. So I think on the one hand, it's providing an extremely empowering dynamic for the public at large and for civil society actors in order to try to mobilize more actors to engage in political activity. At the same time, like we've seen in Russia and China and other places, political elites are also getting more adept at learning how to control social media themselves. And there have been several bills passed or introduced into the Nigerian legislature to try to restrict social media strongly. So far, civil society has been able to resist and to form coalitions in the legislature to try to prevent that. But I think it's only a matter of time before the Nigerian government's going to get better at trying to control social media, much like Russia and China has, and I think there's going to be a period of civil society having to fall back and try to change that dynamic.
Does anyone in the audience have a question? Sir. Yeah, I guess.
Hi, thank you. Should I stand or sit?
Whatever you're comfortable with.
All right, I'll sit. During your presentation, I was thinking of the relationship of democracy through a lens of cultural values, and I was thinking about the late 90s, early 2000s, the narrative of Asian rights, where countries like Singapore were producing apologetics for their sort of strongman style politics through a communitarian preference for order, harmony, material prosperity over individual freedom, for example. So my question is there a similar narrative of African rights that would either hinder the development of democracy or support the development of democracy?
Thank you very much. And are we thinking about African rights sort of region-wide vis-a-vis the global picture, or within the countries themselves, or both?
I think we can start general. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. There are still, I think, very important sort of Pan-African, consciousness that's growing, and the social media dimensions we were just talking about, I think, has been pivotal in expanding that dramatically. And one piece we didn't get a chance to talk about that I think has been very important in this has been the African diaspora. Nigeria has a massive diaspora in Britain in particular, and a growing one here in the United States and in other parts of the world. Other African countries are similar in terms of having diasporas. Those individuals have been extremely pivotal, first in terms of sort of small business development and sending financial flows back to the continent, but second in terms of this cultural shift that you're talking about, is making sure that that Pan-African issues remain on the global agenda. Oftentimes when African foreign policies have not been very good about doing that, although I think the regional democratic heroes like South Africa in particular, I think, has been very, very important in terms of pushing the African agenda at the United Nations and at other sort of global fora. So I think that's an important dimension of this that is going to be important, particularly right now in terms of the debate we were talking about earlier about what to do with this new great power competition on the continent. So how can Africa best use the competition between China, Russia, India now increasingly, and of course the United States and European powers, and to try to play them off against each other to Africa's benefit in a way that has broad-based public impact rather than just simply enriching oligarchs. And unfortunately, it looks more like enriching oligarchs than it does really broad-based political development. And I think that's one important aspect of this. I do think at the domestic level, a sense of sort of a broader African nationalism has been a growing theme, and particularly I think among sort of the new growing middle class. And many of these, who are connected to a lot of the technology we're talking about, have a sense of a strong African identity that is progressive and that is drawing on a strong and noble history that is also being discussed more and more in these contexts. And I think there are some really innovative political and civil society movements that are trying to utilize that in a political mobilizing sense. Unfortunately, it's also competing with renewed sort of ethnic pride dimension. So the southeastern movement I mentioned, for instance, which is based in the Igbo southeast of this new Biafra, is primarily sort of focusing on a pan-Igbo diasporan pride and sort of pushing Igbo cultural nationalism at the expense of sort of a pan-Nigerian dimension. So there's going to be those two, I think, trends that are playing out. Thank you.
I saw someone up here. Do you want to just yell or? Okay.
She's low, but she's not that low.
Okay.
I kind of have a general question for you. What do you see is the effect of the African Union on all of the countries, in addition to looking at, the fact that they have economic and political power over the continent, while also having the regional economic communities? There were 8, now they've kind of consolidated that. Back in 2015, they came up with the tripartite, which has really split Africa in half in terms of economic development. So how do you see their role in this whole democratization of the 50+ continents while they're trying to get this unification activity on an economic and political level to give more economic clout in the world? So I guess I'll kind of let you ask that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that there's been, my impression has been there's been a lot of hand-wringing about the missed opportunities in regard to the African Union. I think it certainly has been active across a lot of the issues we're discussing, but I think because of the prevalence of the security problems across the continent, I think the African Union has been hyper-focused on that issue in particular. And I think where it's been perhaps most effective is that I think the United Nations has been very good at its first port of call when it tries to do anything on the continent, is it goes to the African Union first and tries to work with the African Union, particularly to organize mediators, to try to go in and to work with conflict scenarios, and oftentimes turning to former heads of state who play these kind of eminent person's role in trying to work with factions on the ground and to try to restore some semblance of security. So there have been efforts at times, and I personally, I guess, would argue that the bright spots in African Union activity have been periods where Nigeria and South Africa were stronger internally, and where particularly President Obasanjo and Thabo Mbeki had a really important working relationship in the first decade of the century, where the African Union really came alive and I think was really active on a host of these issues. But as we've seen increasing sort of democratic backsliding across many of the countries on the continent, I think we've also seen a backsliding more so into internal oligarchic sort of corruption politics. And unfortunately, on a lot of big moments where there have been coups or there have been important sort of turning points on the continent, the African Union has been neutralized by the fact that many of its key actors have not utilized it in the way that it could in terms of the potential that it has. But I'm really happy you brought up some of the regional organizations, because I think we've seen moments where some of the sub-regional organizations, ECOWAS in West Africa, the East African Community, and of course SADC in the Southern African Zone, have stepped into the gap at critical times to try to help. The West African Community has been important in condemning coups in the West African region, and has also taken a number of efforts in terms of trying to beat back insurgents in Mali. Now, I think those efforts have not been as successful as we've hoped, but at least those organizations have taken some lead in that regard. And I do think that there's a lot of promise there if we see some of the regional good guys like Ghana, South Africa. I think Kenya, is on the right track in that direction to try to utilize these regional institutions in cooperation with some of the global institutions to try to move things forward. The other thing I'm really hopeful about, and something I've seen at least in the last 10 years, is the growth of regional civil society networks that have gotten more and more effective. Getting back to the social media points you mentioned, in terms of building some of these regional networks. And we're working with election reform activists, for instance, in building networks, so that it's too hot for Zimbabwean activists to criticize the Zimbabwean government, but Nigerian activists can do that on behalf of Zimbabwe, and vice versa. Zimbabwean activists can criticize the Nigerian government on behalf of their Nigerian colleagues. So these Pan-African civil society coalitions can then go to the African Union and to some of these regional organizations, and ultimately to the United Nations, and can try to increasingly sort of put the spotlight on some of these the governments that I think that are unfortunately going in the wrong direction over the next 5 years. So that might provide an important backstop. In the end, it cannot, I think, substitute for the rise of the sort of internal pro-democracy forces that opposition, as I was saying earlier, really is the real driving force. But they can at least provide some safeguards to try to put the brakes on when the car is heading in the wrong direction.
Got the mic.
And I'll end my question on that.
Tim, you're our timekeeper. How much longer can we carry on?
I'd say we've got another 5 or so minutes, so 1 or 2 more questions.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
You want me to say?
Yep, please.
Okay, I'm interested in China's Silk Road agenda and how it's playing out in Africa. And if you were to fast forward 35, 40, 50 years, which is the long play that China is involved in, who is caught up in that web? How are they caught up? And how is the roll-up that China plans over time? What do you think that looks like? If you were to think about it, in many ways, economically, culturally, by virtue of the number of Chinese who are off-sited in different countries, and all of those kinds of things.
Sorry. Okay, all right, I'll just put it there for now. You can hear me okay? Okay, thank you for the question. And so, just to repeat it, looking at a projection of the next sort of 40, 50 years, and what role China is in sort of a lot of these region-wide trends that we're talking about, particularly in terms of sort of democratic development, or I also heard economic development in your question, is that right?
I'm thinking of the entire Silk Road approach and their goals in rolling up various aspects in service to their long-term needs in China. So I'm looking at that and how you see that. Who's caught up in that web? Why? How is that? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I think China is definitely
I think we're already at a point where China is probably the dominant power on the continent. I think Chinese investment, except in a number of key instances, far outstrips Western investment and Russian and Indian investment. If you get outside of the energy sector, if you're looking in just the oil sector, then it's a more varied picture. But if you look outside of that sector, and you see, the Chinese footprint all across the continent. You find it, in the remotest parts of Nigeria and other parts of the continent where you just don't find Western or Indian or Australian or other investment actors. And in particular, China is, in the first decade of its investment, was very much focused on infrastructure development, roads, railroads, that sort of thing. But it's definitely diversified in the last 5 to 10 years in a host of other sectors of the economy. And particularly, of course, as you mentioned with the Silk Road, thinking about resource extraction. But on the back of that investment over the last 20 years, we've also seen an increasing Chinese diaspora growing and living in Africa itself, which is having important roles in terms of local politics. I think it's still early, but it depends on the country that you look like. We've already, in the last 10 years, we've seen anti-Chinese riots in Zimbabwe, in some parts of southern and eastern Africa. In Nigeria is such a big country. The Chinese role has been generally welcomed or tolerated. But I think the more that Chinese business gains a greater strength in Lagos and other important business hubs, I think we're also going to see potential pushback because of a lot of the cultural differences that play out there. Many of the Chinese business folks still have a strong insularity in terms of just social life and business activity that's happening there, which I think has been a detriment in terms of building the kind of relationships that you see other immigrant communities, like say the Lebanese community in Nigeria, which is deeply integrated into Nigerian culture and society, and has a lot of local political alliances, and has managed to navigate the various ups and downs of Nigerian history very well. So I think in sort of 40 to 50 years, there's going to be certainly a really strong Chinese economic interest across the continent, and a subsequent strong political influence across the continent. I think a big question is going to be how much sort of popular backlash at immigration, but also Chinese control of various aspects of these economies. Will we see a sort of a new nationalization trend in 20 years that pushes back on Chinese control of a lot of this sort of infrastructure, and what will that picture look like at that point in time? I think a big part of this of these paths looking forward in 20 to 30 years is going to be a question of what happens in terms of this choice I made between sort of the militant and the entrepreneur. Are we going to see the African middle class grow sufficiently to be able to have enough political influence to be able to pull the state toward a broader public policy agenda, which would lead to a more responsible public policy that one would expect then to lead to policy that forces Chinese investment to do sort of the right thing in terms of opening doors for African entrepreneurs, opening opportunities, technology transfer, all the sorts of things that African economies need? Or are we going to see more of sort of this turn toward militancy, and are we going to see more countries that look like Congo, where you have strong sort of extractive industries that are dominated by warlord-like individuals, or these sort of oligarchic networks that make side deals with Chinese and other, not just Chinese, but other sort of global industries in order to get out whatever we need for our cell phones and other sort of energy needs. I imagine that we're going to see sort of a mix of both of those across the continent. The big question for me are what are the countries that are tilting on the edge, like Nigeria and Kenya, are the ones to watch in my mind. South Africa as well. I think South Africa's on a better trajectory, but I think the ANC is still in a position to make some bad decisions in this regard. And so as long as they stay on the path, then I think if those key pivotal countries can turn the corner, and I think this is where U.S. foreign policy comes in terms of connecting to some of these key sort of pivotal countries to make sure that they're able to turn the corner over the next 20, 30 years will be important. Thank you.
we do have one question from an online member, Desmond Thorpe, who is asking for you to give a little bit of insight into, if you can, into the state of democracy in Rwanda, and particularly couple that with their economic success that they've seen.
Thank you. Thank you, Desmond. I think that Rwanda is sort of the epitome of the extremes of that chart that I showed you from the Ibrahim Index. On the one hand, increasing economic opportunity, and on the other hand, growing sort of lack of political participation. Although I think there have been some important dimensions at the local level where the Rwandan government has opened some doors for local public participation, particularly in terms of anti-corruption activities. And I think that's a really important door that Rwanda has opened, because it's a little bit of a poison pill for autocracy, in the sense that once you open these doors for public participation, it raises expectations. And Rwanda is small enough of a country that the sort of civic actors in Rwanda, although Rwanda is, like Russia in terms of being, have a really strong government that's able to keep a real control on civil society and media actors, I think that there's enough opportunities opening that may open the door for more sort of Rwandan civic action. The thing that worries me most about Rwanda and it's sort of the Rwandan economic model is that we don't have a single example of an authoritarian developmentalist model on the African continent like we do in Taiwan, South Korea, Malaysia, and other parts of East Asia. Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire was the great sort of example of that up until the early 1990s, where we had an authoritarian developmentalist model. And then when the old man passed on in the mid-1990s, you see things unravel, and Cote d'Ivoire became as divided a country as many others on the continent. And I have that exact same worry about Rwanda, is that what will happen when Kagame loses power? Is he going to be able to hand over power to someone who's going to continue that sort of developmentalist model? And what's going to happen when you have enough sort of middle-class development where these sorts of pressures for increasing pluralization begin to push? Will whoever Kagame's successor or successors tend to be able to sort of hold things together? We don't have an example of that on the continent, and unfortunately in Rwanda's case, because of the hyperpolarization of Hutu-Tutsi in the past, even though Rwanda has gone to great lengths to try to deny and to try to minimize the existence of these big cultural differences, they're still very much there. And I worry what's going to happen when the Hutu majority starts pushing again at some point when Kagame steps down. But the happy face sort of in terms of the future for Rwanda is that Kagame is going to begin to think about more than economic development, but begin to think about political development and think about political transition. Will he begin to make the tough decisions of thinking about, will he allow opposing points of political view in a way that is serious enough to actually challenge the ruling party? And I haven't seen any indication that that's happening yet, but he's obviously got a few more years to do that. I think that'll be the critical question mark in my mind as to whether Rwanda is able to continue.
Great, thanks. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I hope you'll all join me in thanking Professor Kew for a very, very interesting evening. Thanks a lot. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.